Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're sailing right into the world of the Vikings.
Yeah, those fascinating North Germanic people from Scandinavia, active mostly between the late 8th and late 11th centuries. They really shaped a lot of Europe.
And to steer us through this, we're mainly looking at the Wikipedia article Vikings. It's
Yeah.
pretty comprehensive, seems to cover the voyages, the impact, their culture.
And their legacy, yeah. It gives us a really solid base to work from.
So, our goal here is, to get past the usual stuff, the horn helmets we all picture, and really trying to understand the complexity. What made Viking society tick?
What drove them?
Yeah.
And what marks did they leave? Because they left marks all over the place.
Okay, let's dive in then. Did you know, for instance, they traveled as far west as North America, Newfoundland specifically?
And then all the way the other direction, the Mediterranean, even parts of the Middle East. That's quite a range.
It really is astonishing. Shows their seafaring skills, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And their ambition. What's also interesting is the name itself, Viking. It might not have started as like an ethnic label.
Oh,
Yeah, some theories suggest it was more about an activity, maybe something to do with rowing shifts on the ships, that kind of thing.
huh. Rowing shifts. And here's another kicker. They played a pretty big role in early Russian history, laying the foundations for Kievan Russes.
That's right. So like you said, definitely more going on than just raiding and pillaging, though that was part of it, of course.
For sure. Okay, so let's start defining this term Viking. Geographically, we're talking Scandinavia, right?
Present day, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, that's the homeland.
And the time frame you mentioned, the late 8th to late 11th centuries, the Viking Age.
Exactly. But Viking itself, it covered a lot of ground. Activities like raiding, yes, but also piracy. Definitely trade, lots of trade, and settling new lands.
Well, the term can be pretty broad. Sometimes it just means anyone living back in Scandinavia during that specific period.
Right. Though the word itself, Viking, its origin is, well, it's debated.
Ah, okay. What are the main ideas?
Well, there are older theories connecting it to Old English or Old Frisian words, like Weising or Wising, hinting at maybe settlement or something similar.
Settlement.
There's also a less popular idea linking it to a word Vik, meaning a creek or inlet, like somewhere you'd pull your boat in,
Makes sense. Hiding in inlets.
perhaps.
Yep.
But a more recent theory, and one that seems to have better linguistic backing, ties it to Old Norse Vika,
Vika.
yeah, meaning a sea mile, or maybe the distance covered between shifts of rowers on a ship.
Oh, back to the rowing shifts. That nautical link feels right, doesn't it? Given everything we know about their ships and travels.
It really does, and it fits how the word was often used back then in medieval times. Viking often meant specifically Scandinavian pirates or raiders.
Not just any Scandinavian person.
Exactly. They'd use terms like Northmen or Danes, more for the general population. So Viking might have been more about what you did going raiding overseas than who you were ethnically.
Then later on, like in the 18th century, you get this Viking revival.
And the term gets sort of romanticized. The fierce warrior, the noble adventurer, that kind of image.
And now today, we tend to use it really broadly for pretty much anyone from that culture during the Viking Age.
Yeah, and as an adjective too, right? Viking age, Viking culture, Viking ship.
But it's useful to remember that slight distinction. Vikings often implies the seafarers, the raiders, the explorers.
Whereas Norseman
Yeah.
is maybe the broader term for the North Germanic people they belong to. A subtle but helpful difference sometimes.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the Viking Age itself, this huge period of expansion and impact. We're talking roughly 793, the first recorded raids.
Lindisfarne, yeah. That's the traditional starting point, all the way up to 1066 and the Norman conquest of England.
Which was, ironically, led by descendants of Vikings who settled in France.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shows how things came full circle. And the geographical reach during this time, incredible. From Scandinavia, they spread out, establishing control in places like the Danelaw in England.
Large parts of England under Norse law.
Right. And their ships just opened up everything. The Norwegian Sea, the Baltic, they settled north, west, east.
They didn't just raid and leave. They built settlements, governments even, in the British Isles, the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland.
Normandy, of course, parts of the Baltic coast.
Yeah.
And those eastern trade routes. The Varangians, as they were called there.
Trading down the rivers, serving the Byzantine emperor, connecting Scandinavia to Constantinople and beyond.
And it's amazing how new cultures actually sprang from these colonies.
Yeah.
The Normans, as we mentioned, the Norse Gaels in Ireland and Scotland, the Russes, giving Russia its name.
The Faroes, the Icelanders, all traceable back to this expansion.
And their voyages went way beyond northern Europe, down into the Mediterranean.
serving as elite bodyguards for the Byzantine emperor, the Varangian Guard, even attacking Constantinople itself at times.
It's quite something. And then pushing west, North America. That brief settlement in Newfoundland, Vinland, around 1000 AD, just mind-blowing.
It really puts their world into perspective. And while they were out exploring and settling,
They were also bringing things back. Slaves, unfortunately, were part of it, concubines too, but also foreign goods, ideas, cultural influences. It changed Scandinavia itself.
and shaped its genetics and history. Plus, back home, this era saw smaller kingdoms gradually merging into the larger entities of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
A period of consolidation alongside the expansion. And we shouldn't forget their own distinct culture, the Old Norse language, the runic writing.
Which we'll get more into, yeah. And the big religious shift, moving from their traditional Norse gods towards Christianity over time.
And their society wasn't just warriors. Most were farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, traders. It was a complex, dynamic society undergoing massive changes.
So what kicked it all off? Why this sudden, huge wave of expansion? What were the motivations? Historians have chewed this over a lot, haven't they?
Oh, definitely. And some of the, let's say, simpler explanations don't really hold up on their own anymore.
Like the idea they were just looking for women.
Right, that pops up in some old sources. Dudo St. Quentin mentions it. And Adam O'Brien talked about polygyny among the elite. But it's probably way too simplistic as a main driver for everyone.
Seems likely. What about resisting Christianity? Charlemagne was forcibly converting pagans around that time.
That's another theory, yeah. Professor Rudolf Simek suggested link, maybe as a reaction. But the timing.
Yeah.
It's a bit tricky for the very first raids. Norway, for example, wasn't directly threatened by Charlemagne initially.
So maybe not the sole cause, at least not for the early stuff.
Probably not. It's more likely a whole cocktail of reasons, all interconnected. They were definitely good at exploiting weaknesses elsewhere.
Like Charlemagne's empire starting to fragment after his death, and England being divided into smaller kingdoms.
Exactly. Plus, Western Europe didn't really have strong naval forces to counter them, especially early on. That gave the Vikings a huge advantage with their ships.
And maybe economic shifts played a part. Old trade routes declining, pushing them to find new ones.
That's very possible.
Mm.
And you have to remember, migration and raiding weren't exactly new in Europe at the time. The Vikings just took it to a whole different level, a much larger scale.
Right. Intensifying existing trends, maybe.
Could be. And sure, for some individuals, maybe local factors like scarce resources or, yeah, maybe even trouble finding a partner played a role. But on a larger scale.
What about the slave trade? Was that significant?
Oh, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
It seems to have been a really important economic factor. They raided for slaves, traded them, established routes east towards Byzantium and the caliphates. Slaves were brought back to Scandinavia too.
So a complex web, politics, economics, maybe some social pressures, opportunity, all tangled together.
That seems to be the most plausible picture, yeah. Not just
Yeah.
one single cause.
Okay, let's dive deeper into the culture and society itself. When we think about Viking literature, it's kind of interesting they didn't leave loads of written stuff from the actual period before Christianity took hold.
That's right. What we have from the time are mostly rune stones. You know, those carved stones, often memorials.
Right, I've seen pictures. They look amazing, but the inscriptions are usually quite short, right? Formulaic.
Yeah, typically, so-and-so raised this stone for so-and-so. Not detailed narratives. For those, we often rely on accounts written by people outside Scandinavia.
And those accounts might be, let's say, biased, written by people who were on the receiving end of raids.
Often quite negative, yes. Understandably so, in many cases. Later on, of course, you get the Icelandic sagas.
Ah, yes, the sagas. Incredibly rich stories.
Absolutely. But we have to be a bit careful. They were written down centuries after the Viking Age, based on oral tradition. So historians need to interpret them critically.
Still, a vital source. What about poetry?
Skaldic poetry is very important. It's complex, often composed by court poets for rulers. It gives us glimpses into the mindset, the values, the events of the time.
And their linguistic impact is huge, isn't it? Place names all over Britain.
Oh, definitely. Eaglesay in Orkney, Ormskirk in England, loads of them. And words that came straight into English from Old Norse, like berserk, skull, knife, husband, wife.
Wow, husband and wife too. That's fundamental.
It really shows the level of interaction and settlement. Old Norse massively influenced English and modern Scandinavian languages, obviously.
But less so in Eastern Europe, with Slavic languages.
Apparently, yes. The linguistic impact there seems much more limited, maybe reflecting a different kind of presence, more trade and military posts than mass settlement like in England or Normandy.
Interesting. And those runestones you mentioned, they're not just memorials, are they? Some actually record journeys.
They do. There are runestones found in Sweden that mention voyages to England, known as the England runestones.
Hmm.
Others mention Greece, the Greece runestones.
Wow.
And the Ingvar runestones talk about a fateful expedition east towards the Caspian Sea. They're like little postcards from the edge of their world.
Tangible proof of their travels. And the Jelling stones in Denmark, they're practically historical monuments.
Huge ones, yeah. Commissioned by kings, marking the consolidation of the kingdom and the conversion to Christianity. Really significant. And incredibly, runes were still used in parts of Sweden, like into the 1920s. Elfdalian runes.
That's amazing. A continuity over 1,000 years. Okay, shifting focus slightly, burial sites. These must tell us a lot, too.
Oh, immensely. Archaeology of burials is key, and their practices varied quite a bit.
Not just one way of doing things.
No, you find simple graves dug into the earth, but also large burial mounds, tumuli, and of course the famous ship burials.
Right, burying someone important in their ship.
Yes, usually covered by a mound. And the things buried with the person, grave goods, tell us so much about their status, their life, and maybe their beliefs about the afterlife, what they thought they'd need.
Where are some of the big finds?
Well, Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway are spectacular ship burials. Birka in Sweden is a major trading site with many graves. Jelling in Denmark associated with the stones.
And weren't there some recent finds in Estonia, the Psalm ships?
Yes, absolutely incredible. The earliest known Viking ship burials, and the largest group found together, predate the Lindisfarne raid even, filled with warriors likely from Sweden.
Really pushing back the timeline then. It underscores how central ships were, doesn't it?
Completely central. Ships were everything, transport obviously, but also exploration, raiding, trade, and they had deep religious or symbolic meaning too.
The longship is the classic image, right? Fast, sleek.
That was the warship, the exploration vessel, built for speed, agility, could navigate shallow rivers thanks to its shallow draft, had oars for power when the wind wasn't right.
But they had other types, too.
Oh yes. The Nar was the main merchant ship. Wider, deeper, built to carry cargo. Less glamorous maybe, but vital for trade and colonization.
Made sense, different tools for different jobs, and they had clever sailing tech, too.
They did. Like the Beatas, a sort of spar that helped them sail better against the wind. A neat innovation.
No wonder ships feature so prominently in burials like Oseberg and Gokstad you mentioned, or the Ladby ship in Denmark.
Exactly. High-status individuals afforded that honor. Sometimes animals were sacrificed alongside them, too. The Roskilde ships, found in Denmark, deliberately sunk to block a channel, also taught us a huge amount about their construction. And boat graves at Gamla Uppsala in Sweden. Ships were just woven into the fabric of their society.
Okay, let's talk social structure. It seems like it was pretty layered.
Yeah.
3 main classes.
Broadly speaking, yes. At the bottom, you have the thralls, slaves.
How common were they?
Apparently quite common. A significant part of the workforce, essential for farming and labor. They were captured in raids or sometimes born into slavery.
And above them?
The Karls. These were the free peasants, the landowners, farmers, the backbone of society, really. Most people would have been Karls.
And at the top?
The Jarls. The aristocracies, wealthy, powerful landowners, chieftains, often leading raids or trading expeditions. They held administrative roles too.
Was it a rigid system? Could you move between classes?
It seems there was some social mobility, especially between Karls and Jarls. Maybe less so getting out of thraldom, but success in trade or warfare could potentially elevate a Karl status. Maybe not as rigid as feudalism elsewhere in Europe at the time.
Interesting. And what about this idea of the falag?
Yes. That refers to a kind of fellowship or partnership, often based around trade ventures, owning a ship together, or maybe a military band bound by loyalty. It shows a strong sense of community and mutual obligation.
So within that structure, what was the situation for women? We often get conflicting images.
It's a really interesting area. Generally, yes, it was a patriarchal society. Women were subordinate to men in many ways, but compared to many other parts of medieval Europe at the time, Norse women seem to have had considerably more independence and rights.
Really? Like what?
Well, they had real authority within the household as the husfrua, the mistress of the house. They managed the farm's resources when the men were away, which was often.
Makes sense. Someone had to run things.
And legally, an unmarried woman over 20 was considered of age, legally independent. They could inherit property. Marriage was usually arranged, involved a bride price paid to her family, and a dowry she brought.
But they could also get divorced.
Yes, divorce was possible for both men and women had the right to reclaim their dowry. They could remarry.
What about outside marriage? Concubines.
Concubinage, called frula, existed, especially among the wealthy. Interestingly, children born from these relationships, as well as those born within marriage, generally had inheritance rights, though the status could differ. Widows also held a relatively independent position.
And could women inherit property more broadly?
Yes, under specific circumstances, particularly if there were no male heirs. A woman could become the head of the family in that case.
Were their roles just domestic?
Not entirely. We have evidence of women acting as priestesses, oracles, religious authority. They were involved in arts, crafts, certainly trade on some level, and possibly medicine.
What about the shield maiden idea? Women fighting.
The Shield Maiden. It's a popular image, heavily featured in sagas. Hard archaeological proof is debated, but there are some female burials with weapons, and one famous grave at Birka, long thought to be a male warrior, turned out through DNA to be a high-status woman buried with full military gear.
Wow. So maybe not common, but possible. At least some women held military authority.
It suggests it wasn't impossible, yeah, though maybe exceptional. It's also often noted that women's liberties seem to have gradually decreased after Christianization became widespread.
That's a common pattern, unfortunately. Any other insights from remains?
Skeletal studies suggest Viking women often lived relatively long lives for the period and generally had pretty good nutrition compared to some other medieval populations.
Okay, what did they actually look like beyond the stereotypes?
Well, physically, they'd likely resemble modern Scandinavians.
Yeah.
Fair skin, typically.
Yeah.
Hair color varied. Plenty of blondes, yes, but also reds, browns, darker hair.
Yeah.
Genetics actually show regional differences in hair color frequency.
So not all blonde giants.
Definitely not. Most men seem to have favored shoulder-length hair and beards. Shorter hair might have been associated with thralls, perhaps.
And I read somewhere they sometimes bleached their hair.
Yes. Some accounts, particularly regarding men in certain regions, mention using a strong lye soap to bleach hair and beards, maybe to a more yellowish or golden color. And also for hygiene, it would have helped with lice.
Right. So grooming was actually a thing, not just rough and dirty.
It seems so. Archaeologists find lots of combs, tweezers, even ear spoons in Viking graves. Suggests they cared about personal hygiene and appearance more than the barbarian image suggests.
And clothes, jewelry.
Clothing would vary with status, of course. Jarls and wealthy individuals wore finer materials, imported fabrics, more elaborate jewelry brooches, necklaces, arm rings. But everyday clothing was likely practical woolens and linens. Earrings seem to have been less common, maybe seen as more of a Slavic fashion at the time.
Right. Practicalities. Let's talk food. What was on the menu in the Viking Age?
It seems to have been pretty varied, actually. We know from analyzing rubbish pits, latrines, bones, and also from descriptions in sagas.
So what kind of things?
Lots of meat, beef, pork, mutton, goat, poultry too. Plenty of fish and seafood, especially in coastal areas, obviously. Different kinds of bread, likely rye and barley, were common. Dairy was huge. Milk, butter, cheese, skyr, that is sort of fermented milk product.
Skyr, still popular today.
Exactly. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, peas, beans. They gathered wild fruits, berries, nuts. Apples and plums were cultivated.
What about drinks? Besides water and milk?
Beer was the everyday drink. Mead honey wine was popular too, maybe more for festivities. Actual grape wine was an expensive import, mostly for the rich.
And livestock. Any specific breeds?
Yeah, they had hardy types suited to the climate, the ancestors of modern Icelandic horses and cattle, various sheep breeds like the goat sheep, specific poultry like the Danish hen and goose.
Did the diet change depending on where they settled?
Oh, for sure. Like in Viking York in England, excavations show lots of beef, mutton, pork, but also tons of fish, oysters, even wild birds.
Yeah.
They adapted to local resources.
Sounds fairly balanced overall.
It could be. They used herbs and spices too, some imported like maybe cinnamon, others homegrown like dill or coriander. Flax was important for oil, food, and linen fiber.
Any downsides?
Well, for the average person, the quality wasn't always great. Sometimes bread might have had weed seeds mixed in with the grain. And a common issue found in skeletal remains is heavy tooth wear.
Why is that?
From the grit. The stone querns used to grind grain would shed tiny stone fragments into the flour. Over a lifetime, that really wore down teeth.
Okay, so it wasn't all farming, trading, and raiding. Did they have fun? Sports? Games?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Physical prowess was valued. Lots of sports were basically training for warfare. Spear throwing, stone throwing, wrestling, including a specific Norse style called glima, fist fighting, stone lifting for strength.
Sounds tough. Anything else?
Agility and balance were important too. Running, jumping. There's mention of a strange sport jumping between the oars of a moving ship.
That sounds risky.
Extremely. Swimming was popular. They even had different strokes in competitions. And in winter, of course, skiing and ice skating using bone skates.
Bone skates. Wow. What about animals and sports?
Horse fighting was a thing, apparently quite popular, especially in Iceland. And hunting was probably both for food and sport, particularly in places like Denmark.
And more relaxed games.
Absolutely. They loved board games. Tafel games, especially Nafafel, were very popular strategy games, a bit like chess. Dice games, too. And social gatherings would involve music.
What kind of instruments?
Signs suggest things like harps, lyres, lutes, fiddles. Plus, storytelling and reciting poetry, especially the skaldic verses, were major forms of entertainment at feasts.
So as they settled in these new places like England or Normandy, did they just blend in, assimilate?
It varied a lot. In some places, like Normandy, assimilation was surprisingly quick. They adopted the local language, Christianity, Frankish customs within a few generations.
Why so fast there?
Maybe strong leadership, pushing for integration,
Mm.
strategic marriages, the need to consolidate power in a new land surrounded by others. But in other places,
Like Iceland.
exactly, Iceland and the Faroes were more isolated, settled mainly by Norse people. So their specific Norse language and culture remained distinct for much, much longer. It really depended on the context of the settlement.
Let's talk warfare directly. What were the key weapons? We always see swords and axes.
Well, swords were high-status weapons, expensive to make. Your average free farmer, the Carl, was obligated by law to own weapons, but more likely had a spear and a shield.
Spear and shield, the basic kit.
Yeah. And probably a sex that's a kind of large, single-edged knife, useful as both a tool and a weapon. Bows and arrows were used too, especially at the start of battles or sieges, but maybe seen as less honorable than close combat for some warriors.
And axes, the iconic Viking axe.
Axes were definitely common, cheaper than swords and effective. The big two-handed Dane axe, though, that was more of an elite weapon. Think high-status warriors, housecarls, the Varangian Guard, devastating in the right hands.
And their religion must have played into their fighting spirit. Thor, Odin, warrior gods.
Absolutely. Belief in Odin, the god of war and death, who welcomed slain warriors to Valhalla, that could certainly provide motivation. And Thor as a protector. Religion was deeply intertwined with warfare. Violence itself seems to have been pretty prevalent, maybe more so in Norway than in Denmark, which was becoming more centralized.
What about the berserkers, those frenzied warriors?
Ah, the berserkers. Legends speak of them fighting in a trance-like fury, biting their shields, immune to pain. Fascinating stuff.
But what caused it? Drugs. Mushrooms.
That's the popular theory. Psychoactive substances like certain mushrooms or maybe mass amounts of alcohol. But the actual evidence is thin.
Really? No proof.
No definitive archaeological proof, like finding drug paraphernalia in specific warrior graves. And the literary sources are often late or ambiguous. So while the phenomenon of battle fury might have existed, perhaps psychological, perhaps induced the specific causes often suggested, like mushrooms, remain largely speculative.
Okay, moving away from fighting. Trade. This seems like a really big, maybe sometimes underestimated part of the Viking world.
Hugely important. They weren't just raiders, they were incredibly active traders. Their networks spanned vast distances and really influenced economic development across Europe and Scandinavia.
How did trade work? Did they use coins?
Coins existed, especially later on, but for much of the period it was more of a bullion economy, based on weight, primarily silver, fragments of silver jewelry, coins from elsewhere, ingots. It was all weighed out.
So merchants carried scales.
Yes, small portable scales are common finds in trading sites and graves, essential tool for business.
What kind of stuff were they importing, bringing into Scandinavia?
Luxury goods, often. Spices from the east, like cinnamon. Glass, which they often made into beads. Silk from Byzantium or further east. Wine from France and Germany. Pottery. Weapons sometimes.
And what were they exporting? What did Scandinavia have to offer?
Lots of raw materials and crafted goods. Amber from the Baltic. Furs highly prized. Good quality woolen cloth. Down feathers for bedding. Slaves, as we mentioned. Weapons they crafted. Walrus ivory was a valuable commodity. Wax, salt, dried codfish. Even hunting falcons.
Falcons, wow.
Yeah, prized by European nobility. They also traded things within the Viking world, like soapstone for bowls and lamps from Norway, whetstones for sharpening tools. There's even evidence they traded livestock over long distances, like cattle from Jutland.
It sounds like a really complex, interconnected system, not just opportunistic raiding at all.
Not at all. It required organization, ships capable of carrying cargo, established routes, trading posts like Burka or Hedi. It was a major economic engine.
So, thinking about all this, what's the lasting legacy? How do we still feel the Viking influence today?
Well, the English language is a huge one we already touched on. So many words, even grammatical structures, influenced by Old Norse. It's deeply embedded.
And how were they seen back then, after the initial shock wore off?
Well, the initial shock was profound. Lindisfarne in 793 really set the tone, attacks on monasteries, centers of learning. It led to this image of them as, God's punishment, pagan destroyers.
The wrath of God.
Exactly. That image persisted for a long time in Western sources. But later, maybe starting in the 1890s or so, a more nuanced view began to emerge. People started appreciating their artistry, their craftsmanship, their incredible seamanship and technology.
And we have their own stories, too, eventually.
Right, the Norse mythology, the sagas, the poetry, preserved orally for generations and then thankfully written down, mostly in Iceland, by Christian scholars who still valued the old tales. Plus, we have accounts from Byzantine and Arab writers, Russian chronicles, giving different perspectives.
Then came the Viking revival in the 19th century.
Yeah, linked to Romanticism and growing nationalism in Scandinavia. Suddenly, Vikings became heroic ancestors, symbols of national pride, lots of art, literature, but also sometimes a distortion of history for nationalistic purposes.
And that image got twisted even further in the 20th century, didn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. The Nazis notoriously tried to co-opt Viking imagery and Norse mythology for their racist ideology, looking for pure Aryan roots. Fascist groups in Scandinavia did similar things.
A real perversion of their history.
Absolutely. And on the other side, Soviet historians sometimes downplayed the Norse role in founding Kievan Rus' for their own political reasons. It shows how easily history can be manipulated. Thankfully, places like Novgorod in Russia now acknowledge their Viking roots more openly.
But the fascination continues in popular culture, right?
Oh, massively. Books, films, TV shows like Vikings, comics like Marvel's Thor, video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, even whole music genres like Viking metal. The imagery is incredibly potent.
And people actually try to live it, in a way. Reenactment groups.
Loads of them, all over the world. People dedicated to recreating Viking crafts, clothing, combat techniques. It's a huge hobby.
And the name Viking pops up everywhere. Sports teams.
Minnesota Vikings, yeah. Or remember the Icelandic financiers during the boom years? They were nicknamed Utris Vikingar, the raiding Vikings. For better or worse, the name still carries weight.
And archaeology keeps adding pieces. Experimental archaeology, too.
Yes, building replica ships, sailing them, like the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, which sailed from Roskilde to Dublin and back, testing the theories, learning how things actually worked. It's fascinating.
We should probably tackle some of the big myths head on. The horned helmets.
Right. Let's get that one out of the way. No evidence.
Yeah.
Zero. Viking warriors did not wear horned helmets into battle.
So where did that come from?
It seems to have started with costume designs for Wagner's ring cycle operas in the 19th century. Maybe inspired by some actual Bronze Age helmets found that did have horns, but those were ceremonial and centuries older. Horns on a helmet are just impractical for fighting.
Okay, myth busted. What else? The idea they were just filthy barbarians.
Also largely an exaggeration, fueled by hostile accounts and later stereotypes. As we said, the archaeological evidence points to grooming habits, combs, tweezers. They weren't necessarily less clean than other medieval Europeans.
And drinking from skulls.
Another myth comes from a misunderstanding, a mistranslation really, of a line in Old Norse poetry. It actually referred to drinking horns, which they definitely used. No evidence of routinely using enemy skulls as cups.
What about genetics? Can DNA tell us more about their legacy?
It's a rapidly growing field, adding incredible detail. Studies confirm, unsurprisingly, that modern Scandinavians are closely related to the people of the Viking Age.
But also mixing.
Yes, DNA from Viking burial sites outside Scandinavia and even within shows evidence of intermarriage and mixing with other populations. Female lines often show more local ancestry in settlement areas, while male lines might be more clearly Scandinavian, suggesting patterns of migration.
Can we trace specific groups, like Swedes versus Norwegians?
To some extent. Genetic markers suggest, for example, a stronger Swedish influence in the eastern Baltic, like Estonia and Finland, while Norwegian ancestry is more prominent in Iceland, Greenland, Ireland, and parts of Scotland.
What about England? Can you tell Viking DNA apart from Anglo-Saxon?
That's trickier, because the Anglo-Saxons also came from nearby regions in Northern Europe. But studies are getting better at teasing out the distinct waves of migration. Analysis of remains, like those Salma ship warriors.
From Estonia.
Yes, genetic pointed to them being from central Sweden. DNA from places like Shetland and Orkney shows very strong Norse heritage, particularly in male lines even today, also found in places like Liverpool and northwest England.
So the genetic footprint is definitely still there.
Absolutely. It even helps trace lineage of figures like Somerled, a famous medieval Scottish lord with likely Norse roots. And finding Scandinavian DNA in an elite burial in Poland, it just reinforces how interconnected their world was.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's clear the Vikings were so much more than just the one-dimensional raiders of popular imagination.
Absolutely. Complex societies, incredible travelers, traders, settlers, craftsmen, who left this massive lasting mark on huge swaths of Europe and beyond, in language, culture, politics, even genetics.
We've hit on some surprising things. The possible origin of their name in rowing ships, the sheer scale of their journeys, the rights women had.
And how many popular images, like those helmets, are just plain wrong.
Hopefully, this deep dive has given you, our listener, a clearer, more nuanced picture. Something beyond the stereotypes, but still engaging and, well, packed with info.
And maybe it leaves you with a final thought to chew on. If the popular image of the Viking is so different from the complex reality, what other historical groups or periods might we be misunderstanding just as badly?
Right. What happens when we start critically examining those ingrained perceptions of the past? What else might we discover?